Okay, this is another video for Sophie so that she can read along with Charlie in the Great Glass Elevator. Tonight we're going to go over Chapter 15, Goodbye, Georgina. This is on page 104 if you want to follow along. When Mr. Wonka had finished reading the recipe, he carefully folded the paper and put it back into his pocket. A very, very complicated mixture, he said. Can you wonder why it took me so long to get it just right? He held the bottle up high and gave it a little shake, and the pills rattled loudly inside it like glass beads. Now, sir, he said, offering the bottle first to Grandpa George, will you take one pill or two? Will you solemnly swear, said Grandpa George, that it will do exactly what you say and nothing else? Mr. Wonka placed his free hand on his heart. I swear it, he said. Charlie edged forward. Grandpa Joe came with him. The two of them always stayed close together. Please excuse me for asking, Charlie said, but are you really absolutely sure you've got it quite right? Whatever makes you ask a funny question like that, said Mr. Wonka. I was thinking of the gum you gave to Violet Beauregard, Charlie said. So that's what's bothering you, cried Mr. Wonka. But don't you understand, my dear boy, that I never did give that gum to Violet? She snatched it up without permission, and I shouted, Stop, don't spit it out. But the girl took no notice of me. Now Wonkavite is altogether different. I am offering these pills to your grandparents. I am recommending them. And when taken according to my instructions, they are safe as sugar candy. Of course they are, cried Mr. Bucket. What are you waiting for, all of you? An extraordinary change had come over Mr. Bucket since he had entered the chocolate room. Normally he was a pretty timid sort of person. A lifetime devoted to screwing caps onto the top of toothpaste tubes in a toothpaste factory had turned him into a rather shy and quiet man. But the sight of the marvelous chocolate factory had made his spirit soar. What is more, this business of the pills seemed to have given him a terrific kick. Listen, he cried, going up on the edge of the bed. Mr. Wonka's offering you a new life. Grab it while you can. It's a delicious sensation, Mr. Wonka said, and it's very quick. You will lose a year a second. Exactly 1 year falls away from you for every second that goes by. He stepped forward and placed the bottle of pills gently in the middle of the bed. So here you are, my dears, he said. Help yourself. Come on, cried all the Oompa Loompas together. Come on, old friends, and do what's right. Come make your lives as bright as bright. Just take a dose of this delight, the heavenly magic dynamite. You can't go wrong, you must go right. It's Willy Wonka's Wonkavite. This was too much for the old people in the bed. All of them suddenly made a dive for the bottle. 6 scrawny hands shot out and started scrabbling to get a hold of it. Grandma Georgina got it. She gave a grunt of triumph and unscrewed the cap and tipped all the little brilliant yellow pills onto the blanket in her lap. She cupped her hands around them so the others couldn't reach out and snatch them. All right, she shouted, excited, counting them quickly. There are 12 pills here. That's 6 for me and 3 for each of you. Hey, that's not fair, shrilled Grandma Josephine. It's 4 for each of us. 4 each is right, said Grandpa George. Come on, Georgina, hand over my share. Mr. Wonka shrugged his shoulders and turned his back on them. He hated squabbles. He hated it when people got grabby and selfish. Let them fight it out among themselves, he thought, and he walked away. He walked away slowly down toward the chocolate waterfall. It was an unhappy truth, he told himself, that nearly all the people in the world behave badly when there is something really big at stake. Money is the first thing they fight over most, but these pills were bigger than money. They could do things for you with no amount of money could ever do. They were worth at least $1 million a pill. He knew plenty of rich men who would gladly pay that much in order to become 20 years younger. He reached the riverbank below the waterfall and stood there gazing at the great gush and splash of melted chocolate pouring down. He had hoped the noise of the waterfall would drown out the arguments of the old grandparents in the bed, but it didn't. Even with his back to them, he still couldn't help hearing most of what they were saying. I had them first, Grandma Georgina was shouting, so they're mine to hand out. Oh, no, they're not, shrilled Grandma Josephine. He didn't give them to you. He gave them to all 3 of us. I want my share, and no one's going to stop me getting it, yelled Grandpa George. Come on, woman, hand them over. Then came the voice of Grandpa Joe, cutting in sternly through the revel. Stop this at once, he ordered. All 3 of you, you're behaving like savages. You keep out of this, Joe, and mind your own business, said Grandma Josephine. Now you be careful, Josie, Grandpa Joe went on. 4 is too many for one person anyways. That's right, Charlie said. Please, Grandma, why don't you just take 1 or 2 each, like Mr. Wonka said? That'll leave some for Grandpa Joe and Mother and Father. Yes, cried Mr. Bucket, I'd love one. Oh, wouldn't it be wonderful, said Mrs. Bucket, to be 20 years younger and not have aching feet anymore? Couldn't you just spare 1 for each of us, Mother? I'm afraid not, said Grandma Georgina. "These pills are especially reserved for us three in the bed. Mr. Wonka said so." "I want my share," shouted Grandpa George. "Come on, Georgina, dish them out." "Hey, let me go, you brute," cried Grandma Georgina. "You're hurting me. Ow! All right, all right. I'll share them if you'll stop twisting my arm. That's better. Here's 4 for Josephine, 4 for George, and 4 for me." "Good," said Grandpa George. "Now who's got some water?" Without looking around, Mr. Wonka knew that three Oompa Loompas would be running to the bed with 3 glasses of water. Oompa Loompas were always ready to help. There was a brief pause, and then, "Well, here goes," cried Grandpa George. "Young and beautiful, that's what I'll be," shouted Grandma Josephine. "Farewell, old age," cried Grandma Georgina. "All together now. Down the hatch." Then there was silence. Mr. Wonka was itching to turn around and look, but he forced himself to wait. Out of the corner of one eye he could see a group of Oompa Loompas, all motionless, their eyes fixed intently in the direction of the big bed over by the elevator. Then Charlie's voice broke the silence. "Wow!" he was shouting. "Just look at that! It's fantastic! It's incredible!" "I can't believe it," Grandpa Joe was yelling. "They're getting younger and younger. They really are. Just look at Grandpa George's hair." "And his teeth!" cried Charlie. "Hey, Grandpa, you're getting lovely white teeth all over again." "Mother!" shouted Mrs. Bucket to Grandma Georgina. "Oh, Mother, you're beautiful. You're so young. And just look at Dad," she went on, pointing to Grandpa George. "Isn't he just the handsomest thing?" "What's it feel like, Josie?" asked Grandpa Joe excitedly. "Tell us what it feels like to be back to 30 again. Wait a minute, you're younger than 30. You can't be a day more than 20 now. But that's enough, isn't it? I would stop there if I were you. 20's quite young enough." Mr. Wonka shook his head sadly and passed a hand over his eyes. Had you been standing close to him, you would have heard him murmuring softly under his breath, "Oh, dearie, dearie me, here we go again." "Mother!" cried Mrs. Bucket. Now there was a shrill note of alarm in her voice. "Why don't you stop, Mother? You're going too far. You're way under 20. You can't be more than 15. You're 10. You're getting smaller, Mother." "Josie!" shouted Grandpa Joe. "Hey, Josie, don't do it, Josie. You're shrinking. You're a little girl. Stop her, somebody, quick." "They're all going too far," cried Charlie. "They took too much," said Mr. Bucket. "Mother's shrinking faster than any of them," wailed Mrs. Bucket. "Mother, can't you hear me? Mother, can't you stop?" "My heavens, isn't it quick?" said Mr. Bucket, who seemed to be the only one enjoying it. "It really is a year a second." "But they've hardly got any more years left," wailed Grandpa Joe. "Mother's no more than 4 now," Mrs. Bucket cried out. "She's 3, 2, 1. Gracious me! What's happened to her? Where's she gone? Mother! Georgina! Where are you? Mr. Wonka, come quick, come here! Mr. Wonka, something's frightful's happened. Something's gone wrong. My mother's disappeared." Mr. Wonka sighed and turned around and walked slowly and quite calmly back toward the bed. "Where's my mother?" bawled Mrs. Bucket. "Look at Josephine," cried Grandpa Joe. "Just look at her, I ask you." Mr. Wonka looked first at Grandma Josephine. She was sitting in the middle of the huge bed, bawling her head off. "Wah, wah, wah," she cried. "Wah, wah, 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 wah." "She's a screaming baby," cried Grandpa Joe. "I've got a screaming baby for a wife." "The other one's Grandpa George," Mr. Bucket said, smiling happily. "The slightly bigger one there crawling around. He's my wife's father." "That's right, he's my father," wailed Mrs. Bucket. "And where's Georgina, my old mother? She's vanished. She's nowhere, Mr. Wonka. She's absolutely nowhere. I saw her getting smaller and smaller, and in the end she got so small she disappeared into thin air. What I want to know is where is she gone? And how in the world are we going to get her back? Ladies and gentlemen," said Mr. Wonka, coming up and close and raising both his hands for silence, "please, I beg you, do not ruffle yourselves. There's nothing to worry about." "You call it nothing?" cried poor Mrs. Bucket. "When my old mother's gone up the spout and my father's got a howling baby?" "A lovely baby," said Mr. Wonka. "I quite agree," said Mr. Bucket. "What about my Josie?" cried Grandpa Joe. "What about her?" said Mr. Wonka. "Well, a great improvement, sir," said Mr. Wonka. "Don't you agree?" "Oh, yes," said Grandpa Joe. No, what am I saying? She's a howling baby." "But in perfect health," said Mr. Wonka. "May I ask you, sir, how many pills she took?" "4," said Grandpa Joe glumly. "They all took 4. Mr. Wonka made a wheezing noise in his throat, and a look of great anguish came over his face. "Why, oh, why can't people be more sensible?" he said sadly. "Why don't they listen to me when I tell them something? I explained very carefully beforehand that each pill makes the taker exactly 20 years younger. So if Grandma Josephine took 4 of them, she's automatically became younger by 4 times 20, which is, wait a minute now, 4 twos are 8, and a naught, that's 80. So she's automatically became younger by 80 years. How old, sir, was your wife, may I ask, before this happened?" She was 80 last birthday, Grandpa Joe answered. She was 80 in 3 months. There you are, then, cried Mr. Wonka, flashing a happy smile. The Wonkavite worked perfectly. She is now precisely 3 months old, and a plumper, rosier infant I have never set eyes on. Nor me, said Mr. Bucket. She'd win first prize in a baby competition. First prize, said Mr. Wonka. Cheer up, Grandpa, said Charlie, taking the old man's hand in his. Don't be sad. She's a beautiful baby. Madam, said Mr. Wonka, turning to Mrs. Bucket, how old, may I ask, was Grandpa George, your father? 81, wailed Mrs. Bucket. He was 81 exactly, which makes him a great big bouncing 1-year-old boy now, Mr. Wonka said happily. How splendid, said Mr. Bucket to his wife. You'll be the first person in the world to change your father's diapers. He can change his own rotten diapers, said Mrs. Bucket. What I want to know is where's my mother? Where's Grandma Georgina? Aha, said Mr. Wonka. Oh ho, yes indeed. Where, oh where has Georgina gone? How old, please, was the lady in question? 78, Mrs. Bucket told him. Well, of course, laughed Mr. Wonka. That explains it. What explains what? Snapped Mrs. Bucket. My dear madam, said Mr. Wonka, if she was only 78 and she took enough Wonkavite to make her 80 years younger, then naturally she's vanished. She's bitten off more than she could chew. She's taken off more years than she had. Explain yourself, said Mrs. Bucket. Simple arithmetic, said Mr. Wonka. Subtract 80 from 78, and what do you get? -2, shouted Charlie. Hooray, said Mr. Bucket. My mother-in-law's -2 years old. Impossible, said Mrs. Bucket. It's true, said Mr. Wonka. So where is she now, may I ask? Said Mrs. Bucket. That's a good question, said Mr. Wonka. A very good question, yes indeed. Where is she now? You don't have the foggiest idea, do you? Of course I do. I know exactly where she is, said Mr. Wonka. Then tell me. You must try to understand, said Mr. Wonka, that if she is now -2, she's got to add 2 more years before she can start again from naught. She has to wait it out. Where does she wait? In the waiting room, of course, said Mr. Wonka. Boom, boom, said the drums of the Oompa Loompa band. Boom, 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 boom. And all the Oompa Loompas and all the hundreds of them standing there in the chocolate room began to sway and hop and dance to the rhythm of the music. Attention, please, they sang. Attention, please, attention, please. Don't dare to talk, don't dare to sneeze, don't doze or daydream, stay awake, your health, your very life's at stake. Ho, ho, you say, they can't mean me. Ha, ha, we answer, wait and see. Did any of you ever meet a child called Goldie Pinklesweet, who on her 7th birthday went to stay with Granny down in Kent? At lunchtime on the 2nd day of dearest little Goldie's stay, Granny announced, I'm going down to do some shopping in the town. Do you know why Granny didn't tell the child to come along as well? She's going to the nearest inn to buy herself a double gin. So out she creeps. She shuts the door, and Goldie, after making sure that she is really by herself, goes quickly to the medicine shelf, and there her little greedy eyes sees pills of every shape and size. Such fascinating colors, too. Some green, some pink, some brown, some blue. All right, she says, let's try the brown. She takes one pill and gulps it down. Yum, yum, she cries. Hooray, what fun. They're chocolate-coated, every one. She gobbles 5, she gobbles 10. She stops her gobbling only when the last pill's gone. There are no more. Slowly she rises from the floor. She stops. She hiccups. Dear, oh dear. She starts to feel a trifle queer. You see, how could young Goldie know? For no one had told her so, that Grandmama, her old relation, suffered from frightful constipation. That meant that every night she'd give herself a powerful laxative. And all the medicines she'd bought were naturally of this sort. The pink and red and blue and green were all extremely strong and mean, but far more fierce and meaner still was Granny's little chocolate pill. Its blast effect was quite uncanny. It used to shake up even Granny. In point of fact, she did not dare to use them more than twice a year. Can you wonder, little Goldie began to feel a wee bit moldy? Inside her tummy something stirred. A funny gurgling sound was heard, and oh dear, from deep within the ghastly rumbling sounds begin. The rumblinate, and roar and boom. They bounce and echo round the room. The floorboard shake, and from the wall some bits of paint and plaster fall. Explosions, whistles, awful bangs were followed by the loudest clangs. A man next door was heard to say, a thunderstorm is on its way. But on and on the rumbling goes. A window cracks, a lamp bulb blows. Young Goldie clutched herself and cried, there's something wrong with my inside. This was, we very greatly fear, the understatement of the year. For wouldn't any child feel crummy with loud explosions in her tummy? Granny at 2:30 came in, weaving a little from the gin, but even so she quickly saw the empty bottle on the floor. "My precious laxative!" she cried. "I don't feel well," the girl replied. Angrily, Grandma shook her head. "I'm really not surprised," she said. "Why can't you leave my pills alone?" With that she grabbed the telephone and shouted, "Listen, send us quick, an ambulance, the child is sick. It's number 50, Frontwell Road. Come fast, I think she might explode. We're sure you do not wish to hear about the hospital and where they did a lot of horrible things with stomach pumps and rubber rings. Let's answer what you want to know. Did Goldie live or did she go?" The doctors gathered round her bed. "There's really not much hope," they said. "She's going, gone," they cried. "She had her chips. She's dead, she's died." "I'm not so sure," the child replied, and all at once she opened wide her great big bluish eyes and sighed and gave an anxious dox a wink, and said, "I'll be okay, I think." So Goldie lived, and back she went, at first to Granny's place in Kent. Her father's place came the second day, and fetched her in a Chevrolet, and drove her to their home in Dover. But Goldie's troubles were not over. You see, if someone takes enough of any highly dangerous stuff, one will invariably find some traces of it left behind. It pains us greatly to relate that Goldie suffered from this fate. She'd taken such a massive fill of this unpleasant kind of pill, it got into her blood and bones. It messed up all her chromosomes. It made her constantly upset, and she could never really get the beastly stuff to go away. And so the girl was forced to stay for 7 hours every day within the everlasting gloom of what we call the ladies' room. And there she sits, in dreams of glory, alone inside the lavatory. So now, before it's too late, take heed of Goldie's dreadful fate. And seriously, all jokes apart, do promise us across your heart that you will never help yourself to medicine from the medicine shelf. And that ends chapter 15. Tomorrow we'll go over chapter 16, called Vita Wonk and Minus Land. And that will be on page 120. I'll mention it again on the next video just in case you forget. Meantime, have a wonderful sleep and have a good night.